The Galactic Accord had a file on every species in the known galaxy. 14,000 years of records. Births of civilizations. Deaths of civilizations. Wars that rewrote star maps. Alliances that held for 10,000 years. The file system was the single most comprehensive document in the history of organized intelligence, and the beings who maintained it were justifiably proud of it. Earth's file was 3 pages, not because the humans were unimportant, because the analysts who reviewed the initial contact data had looked at what the humans were: aggressive, territorial, physically robust, adaptable under combat conditions, capable of absorbing catastrophic losses and continuing to function, and had made what seemed at the time like a perfectly reasonable classification call. Soldier species. It was a real category. The galaxy had several. Species whose evolutionary architecture made them exceptional at organized violence, at holding lines, taking ground, suffering casualties without psychological collapse. The Accord had worked with soldier species before. The Dreth, the Valkyr, the Bone clans of Sector 9. They were useful. They were deployable. They were respected in the narrow and specific way that something very good at a very dangerous job is respected. They were not complicated. That was the important part. Soldier species were not complicated. They were not inventors, not diplomats, not architects of political systems or philosophical schools. They were not the species you brought to the table when you needed to solve a problem that couldn't be solved with force. You brought them when the force had already been decided on, and you needed someone to deliver it cleanly. 3 pages. Soldier species. Filed. Categorized. Managed accordingly. Nobody flagged it for review. Nobody thought to ask, what do these creatures do when they're not fighting? That was the question. That was the one that nobody asked. That was the one that, when the answer finally arrived, not announced, not explained, just demonstrated the way humans demonstrated most things, by simply doing the thing in front of everyone before anyone had agreed it was allowed, reorganized every assumption the Accord had built its relationship with Earth on. Humans were soldiers. The galaxy had that right. What the galaxy had wrong, what 3 pages of file notes and 14,000 years of experience with other species had not prepared anyone for, was that being a soldier was not what humans were. It was just a thing they did when you left them no other choice. What they were was considerably harder to categorize, and considerably more dangerous to underestimate. This is what happened when the Accord found out. The first human unit to be formally integrated into a Galactic Accord joint operation was the 14th Combined Arms Battalion, Earth Defense Forces, assigned to the Karathi Front in the winter of what humans called 2189. The Karathi Front was a grinding, miserable stretch of conflict that had been ongoing for 11 years by the time the humans arrived. The Accord's opponent was the Shriven Dominion, an expansionist collective that communicated through chemical signals and had been eating territory along the Galactic Arm's outer edge for 30 years. The Shriven were not brilliant strategists. They were patient, and they were numerous, and they did not place the same value on individual unit survival that most Accord species did, which made them, in the cold mathematics of sustained warfare, extremely difficult to dislodge. The Accord had tried everything that fell within standard operational doctrine. The humans were brought in because standard operational doctrine had produced 11 years of stalemate, and someone in the logistics hierarchy had signed off on integrating a soldier species that the preliminary data suggested had a notably high threshold for adverse operational conditions. The diplomatic language for this was exceptional resilience. The translation, which most of the Accord officers on the Karathi Front understood without needing it spelled out, was, they'll keep fighting when other species would stop. Commander Velreth of the Accord Combined Forces had reviewed the human unit file on the transport to the front. She was Sulhuri, a species with 4 arms, bioluminescent sensory patches along the jaw, and approximately 2,000 years of military tradition behind her. She had commanded joint operations involving 6 different species. She was not inexperienced with the complexities of species integration. She reviewed the human file. She formed an assessment. She would later describe this assessment in a testimony before the Accord Military Review Board as accurate in every particular and wrong in every way that mattered. The 14th arrived at the forward operating base at 0300 in rain that had been falling continuously for 6 days. Velreth observed them disembark from the transitlanders. They were physically striking. The file had noted robust bipedal biology, which did not quite capture what it looked like in person, which was more like watching something that had been engineered specifically to be difficult to stop. Large, dense, moving with the unhurried efficiency of beings who had made peace with being uncomfortable and had decided to be useful anyway. They were also, Velreth noted, loud. Not undisciplined, just loud. They called to each other across the rain in the short, clipped words their language generated when they were doing something physical, and there was laughter in it, which was not a quality Velreth had previously associated with troops arriving at a combat forward operating base in the 6th day of sustained rain. The human commanding officer was a woman named Major Sarah Okafor. She was medium height by human standards, which meant she came up to Velreth's second shoulder joint. She had the quality that Velreth's file had described as high command presence, and that Velreth's own eyes described as someone who had decided at some point early enough in life that it was now just structural, that she would not be managed by circumstances. She shook Velreth's primary hand in the human contact greeting, which still felt faintly surprising no matter how many times Velreth had experienced it. This species greeted strangers by briefly holding their hand, which required a degree of default physical trust that most Accord species would consider alarming, and said, "Commander, thank you for the posting. My people are ready to work. Not ready to fight. Ready to work." Velreth filed that phrasing away and said nothing about it. The integration briefing happened the next morning. Velreth presented the tactical situation with the precision she applied to everything. 11 years of frontline data, shriven movement patterns, the specific problem of the ridge system at coordinates designated 7 Keth, which had been changing hand for 3 years without either side being able to hold it long enough to establish a defensible position. The ridge was the key to the sector. The sector was the key to the front. The front was the key to stopping shriven expansion in this arm. 3 years. Same ridge. No solution found. The human officers listened. They asked questions, which was normal. The questions were not normal. The first question came from a sergeant named Torres, a compact man with a face that looked like it had been in close contact with several hard objects at various points, and had reached a philosophical accommodation with this history. He asked, "What's the ridge made of?" Velreth processed this. Primarily calcium silicate compound with iron deposits in the upper strata. Standard geological formation for this planetary type. Does it drain? Does it? Velreth stopped. The ridge has drainage channels, yes. Naturally occurring. The rain accumulates and the shriven use chemical signals to communicate. Yes. Torres looked at Okafor. Something passed between them that Velreth's species interaction training identified as a nonverbal communication, a look carrying cargo. Okafor's expression did not change. "Go on," she said. Torres said, "If we controlled what went into those drainage channels, we control what chemical signals the shriven could send on the ridge. You'd essentially have a communications blackout for their forward units every time it rained." Velreth sat with this for a moment. 11 years, 6 planning cycles, 43 tactical reviews, 17 different Accord species represented on the combined staff. Nobody had asked what the ridge was made of. That is, Velreth said carefully, not a standard approach. Okafor said, "We're told the standard approaches have been running for 11 years. Yes. Then, with respect, Commander, we'd like to try some non-standard ones." This was the beginning. Not the beginning of the conflict that had been running for 11 years. The beginning of the Accord's education about what it had classified, filed, and assigned to a forward operating base in the rain without quite understanding what it had done. The drainage channel operation worked. It worked in the first trial, which was supposed to be a proof of concept test, and turned into a full tactical breakthrough because Torres had apparently not considered it useful to plan for partial success. The shriven forward units on the ridge went chemically dark for 4 hours during the heaviest rain of the season. The human 14th moved through positions that 3 years of conventional assault had failed to penetrate, established a defensive perimeter on the upper ridge, and held it through the counterpush that came 6 hours later. The ridge changed hands for the last time. It stayed changed. Velreth filed the after-action report with language she had spent 3 days composing to be accurate without being dramatic. The Accord Military Review Board was not an institution that rewarded drama in official documentation. But she noted clearly and for the record that the tactical solution employed had required knowledge of the enemy species' biology, chemistry, local geology, hydrology, and the intersection of all four, none of which fell within what the human units file had indicated would be their contribution to the operation. The file said, soldier species. The drainage channel operation was not a soldier solution. It was the solution of something that thought about problems the way water thought about obstacles. Not over, not under, but through every available crack until the obstacle was no longer the point. Velreth requested a meeting with Major Okafor the day after the ridge was secured. They sat in the command tent with rain still hammering the external panels, and Velreth asked, without particular ceremony, what the major had studied before her military commission. Okafor looked at her. Environmental engineering. 2 years. Then I cross-trained in logistics. Then I went into service. Environmental engineering. Yes. Velreth thought about the drainage channels. About 11 years and 43 tactical reviews, and nobody asking what the ridge was made of. And Sergeant Torres? Torres. A pause that carried something in it. Warmth, the specific kind that forms around someone you've trusted in bad circumstances. Torres has a doctorate in chemistry. He's also the best room-clearing specialist in the battalion. He holds a doctorate. Half the NCOs in this unit have advanced degrees in something, Okafor said. We're a military commander. We're not a warehouse for people who can't do anything else. Velreth looked at the file she had reviewed on the transport. 3 pages. Soldier species. High resilience. Deployable. Useful. She looked at Okafor. Then she did something that was, in Sulhuri professional culture, a significant gesture. She closed the file. I think, Velreth said, I may need to ask you some questions about your species. Okafor's expression moved into something that Velreth's species interaction training did not have a category for. Not a smile exactly. More like a smile that had been compressed into a single line by someone who had learned to keep it contained in professional settings. That, the major said, is probably a good idea. The questions took 3 weeks. Not formal sessions. They didn't have time for formal sessions because the ridge breakthrough had created operational momentum, and momentum required immediate exploitation, which Okafor and her battalion understood with a fluency that made Velreth's existing allied units look like they were moving through water. But in the margins, in the meal periods that humans insisted on taking communally, a cultural practice that Velreth had initially found inefficient and had come to understand was a load-bearing component of how they maintained unit cohesion under sustained stress. In the transit times between positions, what Velreth learned in 3 weeks reorganized the 3-page file into something that would eventually run to 47 volumes. The humans were soldiers. That part was accurate. Their capacity for organized, disciplined, sustained combat was genuine and significant, and the Accord classification had not been wrong. Under pressure, under casualties, under conditions that had caused other Accord species to request relief rotation, the 14th continued to function. Not robotically, they were loud and expressive, and they processed difficulty in ways that looked, to Sulhuri sensibilities, alarmingly uncontrolled. They argued. They made dark jokes about things that were not funny. They talked about people who had been killed with a directness that made Velreth's cultural protocols flinch. They processed openly, messily, and then kept going. But what the file had missed, what 3 pages could not capture, was that the combat capacity was not the foundation. It was a layer. Under was everything else. The 14th Battalion contained, between its 412 personnel, 11 individuals with advanced degrees in engineering disciplines, 8 in biological sciences, 4 in chemistry, 6 in various branches of mathematics, 3 in architecture, 2 in economics. 1. Corporal Danny Eshu, who ran the unit's communications array with exceptional competence, and also apparently wrote poetry in her off hours, which Velreth discovered when she found a handwritten notebook left in the command tent and returned it. 1 in literature. They were not specialists deployed in specialized roles. They were people who had brought their entire intellectual history into a military context and saw no reason to leave any of it at the door. Torres's chemistry doctorate didn't live in a separate box from his combat training. It lived in the same brain, available simultaneously, looking at every situation through every lens it had. When the Shriven shifted tactics 2 weeks after the Ridge, altering their advance pattern in response to the drainage disruption, it was the biologist, Lieutenant Reyes, whose day job was forward reconnaissance, who noticed that the new pattern matched a foraging behavior documented in a Shriven captive behavioral study published 9 years earlier. A study nobody on the Accord tactical staff had read, because tactical staff didn't typically read behavioral biology papers. Reyes had read it because Reyes had studied behavioral biology before she became a soldier, and the paper had seemed interesting. The pattern recognition took 4 hours off the response time. For hours, in a tactical situation, moving at the speed the Karathi front was now moving was significant. Velreth sent her first escalation report to Accord Military Command at the end of Week 3. It was longer than standard reports. It contained language that her supervisor flagged as unusually interpretive for operational documentation. Velreth, who had been writing operational documentation for 200 years and knew exactly what she was doing with language, left the interpretive sections in. The core of what she was trying to say was this: the classification was wrong. Not maliciously, not carelessly, just wrong. The Accord had looked at humans in the context that they first appeared in, which was a violent one because humans had not had a peaceful first contact. Their first interaction with Accord-adjacent space had been a territorial dispute with a Shriven scouting force that the humans had resolved by methods that left an impression. The impression had shaped the file. The file had shaped the classification. The classification had shaped every decision the Accord made about Earth for 40 years. And in 40 years, nobody had asked what the Ridge was made of. The escalation report asked, formally and for the record, that the Accord conduct a comprehensive reassessment of the human classification. It requested access to Earth's educational and institutional records. It suggested, in measured diplomatic language that nonetheless carried the full weight of 200 years of Velreth's professional credibility, that the Accord had been deploying a library as a blunt instrument and calling it a hammer. The response came back in 2 weeks. It acknowledged the report. It thanked Commander Velreth for her detailed observations. It indicated that a review committee would consider the request for reclassification at the next quarterly session. Quarterly session. Velreth set down the response and looked at the frontline activity report, which showed the 14th Battalion currently engaged in a bridge reconstruction project. Unsolicited, conceived by the human engineer corporal who had simply identified that the bridge needed to exist and started building it, that would cut supply line transit time by 1/3. The quarterly session was 4 months away. The humans were not going to wait 4 months. They never waited for anything. That quality, Velreth was beginning to understand, was not a symptom of impatience. It was a symptom of something for which the Sulhuri language did not have a single clean word. The closest approximation required 3 words combined, a compound that meant, roughly, the inability to observe an unfilled gap without filling it. Not a soldier's quality, a builder's quality, a thinker's quality, a species-wide compulsion to look at every broken thing in range and get to work. 3 pages. Soldier species. Velreth opened a new file, labeled it with the human date system, Earth classification, preliminary reclassification notes, sat in the rain on the Karathi front, and began to write. The document that resulted would, for months later, reached the desk of the Accord's Director of Species Relations, bypassing the quarterly review committee entirely, because Velreth had the seniority to escalate directly and had decided that seniority existed for exactly this kind of situation. The director's response was 4 words. Send me the humans. Not the battalion. Not a unit. The humans. As a concept. As a thing the Accord needed to look at again, from the beginning, without the file. As something that 400,000 years of galactic political history had apparently not made them ready for. Director Ohen Vass of Accord Species Relations had held her position for 60 years, which in Accord institutional terms made her relatively junior. Her predecessor had held the post for 300. The one before that, 412. The office operated on the assumption that relationships between species developed slowly, required patience, and rewarded the kind of long-view thinking that only came from beings who expected to be in the same chair long enough to see consequences unfold. She had read Velreth's preliminary reclassification notes in a single sitting. She had then read them again. She had then done something that her staff, who had worked with her for decades and thought they knew her professional habits completely, had never seen her do. She went to the archive room personally, pulled the Earth file physically from the classification stacks, and stood at the archive table reading 3 pages about a species that had apparently just restructured the entire tactical situation on the Karathi front using drainage channels and behavioral biology papers. 3 pages. She put the file down on the table and did not pick it up again. She sent the forward response to Velreth and began making arrangements. What arrived at Accord Central Station 6 weeks later was not what anyone had prepared for. The director had requested a human delegation, experienced personnel, mixed background, capable of engaging in high-level institutional conversation about the reclassification process. She had framed it diplomatically. She had been specific about what she wanted. What she got was 15 humans who all interpreted experienced personnel, mixed background, in their own individual ways, and apparently nobody had thought to coordinate the interpretations before boarding. Major Okafor was there, which was expected. She had been nominated by Earth Defense Forces Command as the military representative. She arrived in dress uniform, composed, with the contained expression that Velreth had described in her notes, and that Director Ohen Vass recognized immediately as the face of someone performing calm as an act of professional will. Next to her was Dr. Priya Nair, introduced as Earth's representative from the Pan Accord Scientific Liaison Office, which had been established 14 months ago when the Accord first indicated it might want scientists in the conversation, and Earth had responded by standing up an entire office for it within the quarter. Dr. Nair was a physicist by training who had spent the last 10 years working on the theoretical underpinnings of Accord energy technology, apparently finding it full of interesting gaps, and who had the quality of someone who had decided at some point that the most efficient path through any conversation was a straight line. There was also a diplomat, 2 economists, a xenobiologist who specialized in shriven behavioral ecology. Torres had apparently told people about the behavioral biology paper, an architect who had somehow become part of the delegation because she had been working on sustainable infrastructure design for frontier settlements, and someone in Earth Coordination Office had decided that was relevant. And this was the detail that Ohen Vass spent a long time looking at, a 17-year-old, named Jonas Bekele, introduced as Youth Representative, Earth Global Council, who had apparently been included because the Earth Global Council had a formal policy of including youth representation in significant diplomatic engagements, and nobody had told them this was the kind of significant diplomatic engagement where that might seem unusual. Jonas Bekele had a backpack. He was looking at everything. Director Ohen Vass looked at the 15 humans arranged in the arrival hall of Accord Central Station and thought about the 3-page file and thought, yes, this is exactly the problem. The formal sessions began the next morning. Ohen Vass had designed a structured agenda, an introduction to the reclassification process, a review of the current classification criteria, a presentation of the Karathi front data, and then a discussion framework for what a revised classification might look like. It was a good agenda. She had used similar structures for species reclassification proceedings before twice. The sessions typically ran 3 to 5 days and produced a revised classification document that went back to the review committee. The agenda lasted approximately 4 hours. Not because it was a bad agenda, because the humans engaged with it the way they apparently engaged with everything, fully from every angle simultaneously, pulling threads that the agenda had not anticipated and following them in a territory that HFY had not scheduled but that kept turning out to be relevant. Dr. Nair opened the thread about the classification criteria themselves. Not the Earth classification specifically, the criteria, the standards by which the Accord evaluated what a species was. She asked, in the direct and non-apologetic way that HFY was going to come to recognize as the human default register for asking difficult questions, who decided that military capacity was a primary classification category? HFY said it had evolved over 14,000 years of accumulated classification practice. Dr. Nair said, so nobody decided. It accumulated. That is one way to, because accumulated practices have a way of encoding the assumptions of the beings who did the accumulating. And if the beings doing the accumulating were primarily evaluating species they encountered in conflict situations, then conflict capacity would naturally become a primary category. Not because it's the most important thing about a species, just because it's the most visible thing in the context where the evaluation happened. Silence in the session room. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that follows a thing being said clearly that people had been aware of in a less clear form for a long time. Okafor was watching Dr. Nair with the expression HFY had already started to recognize as knowing exactly where this is going. Dr. Nair continued, I'm not saying the classification system is malicious. I'm saying it's a tool shaped by its history. And a tool shaped by its history will always do certain things well and miss certain other things consistently. What did you miss? What the Accord had missed, as it turned out, was a great deal. The reclassification discussion that was supposed to take 3 to 5 days ran for 3 weeks. Not because it was contentious, it was not, mostly. It ran long because the humans kept revealing new layers and the Accord kept having to integrate them, and integration took time because some of the layers required existing Accord frameworks to be substantially reorganized before they could hold the new information. Day 3 brought the economic discussion. The two human economists, Dr. Fatima Al-Hassan and a former interplanetary trade negotiator named Henrik Sorensen, had reviewed the Accord's existing relationship with Earth in the economic domain and come prepared to discuss it with a level of analytical detail that suggested they had been reviewing it for considerably longer than the 6 weeks since the invitation. They had. Al-Hassan, it emerged, had been studying Accord Earth economic agreements since the first contact treaties were signed 40 years ago as her doctoral research, and had continued the work at an institutional level since. She had notes, extensive ones, organized in a way that communicated, without explicitly saying so, that she had been waiting for exactly this kind of session for approximately 18 years. What she presented over 2 days was a picture of economic arrangements that had been structured entirely around the assumption that Earth's primary contribution to the Accord relationship was military. Resource agreements that traded Earth's raw material exports for technology transfers, but which capped the technology transfers in categories that assumed Earth would primarily need weapons and defensive systems. Trade frameworks that positioned Earth as a supplier of manufactured goods, but excluded Earth companies from participation in Accord-level infrastructure development. Partnership agreements that were under examination, not partnership agreements at all, but deployment contracts with better diplomatic language. The Accord representatives in the room, HFY and 3 senior staff, sat with this presentation and felt the particular institutional discomfort of realizing that something they had been doing for 40 years with complete sincerity was not what they had believed it to be. It had not been exploitation, exactly. The Accord had not set out to confine Earth. It had set out to integrate Earth in the way it integrated all species it classified as soldier category, with respect for what they were, with appropriate support for what they did, and with the category firmly in place as the organizing principle of the relationship. The category had been wrong. The relationship had been built on the wrong category for 40 years. Okafor, who had been quiet for most of the economic sessions, listening, Ohen Vass noticed, with her full attention, the way she listened to everything, spoke during the final economic session. She said, "I want to be clear that we're not here to assign blame for this. We understand how classifications work, and we understand how this happened. But I think there's a conversation we need to have about what an accurate category looks like, and what a relationship built on an accurate category would need to include." She paused, looked at the table, then at Ohen Vass. "Because we've been in a core relationship for 40 years, and nobody has ever asked us what we want to build. Nobody had. That was the center of it. 3 pages, soldier species, deployable, managed. What do you want was not a question you asked the tool. Tools wanted nothing. They were maintained and deployed, and the question of what they wanted was not part of the operational vocabulary. The humans were not a tool." The director spent 3 days after the economic session processing what that meant at the institutional level. Not personally, she had understood it somewhere in the first morning when Jonas Bekele, the 17-year-old with the backpack, had raised his hand during the classification criteria discussion and asked whether the Accord's first contact protocols included questions about what the species being contacted valued. And Ohen Vass had opened her mouth to say yes, and then close it again because the honest answer was that the first contact protocol included questions about military capacity, territorial requirements, resource needs, and threat assessment, and what do you value was not on the list. She had kept thinking about that question for 3 days. It was a 17-year-old's question, the kind of question that people who had been in institutions for a long time stopped asking because they had stopped noticing it wasn't being asked. On day 11, the xenobiologist, Dr. Cam Osei, who had been quietly observing sessions and taking notes since arrival, presented his preliminary analysis of shriven behavioral ecology and its tactical implications. It was not on the agenda. He asked if he could speak. Ohen Vass said yes because she had stopped trying to enforce the agenda 4 days earlier. What Osei presented was, in terms of its tactical implications, significant enough that 3 of the Accord staff went immediately to their communication arrays to alert the Karathi Front Command. But what struck Ohen Vass was not the tactical content. It was that Osei had produced this analysis in the margins of a diplomatic reclassification proceeding, using the time between formal sessions because he had access to shriven behavioral data that the Accord's military analysis division had not connected to the current tactical situation, and he had connected it because his specialty was behavioral ecology, and he was physically present, and the connection seemed obvious to him. He wasn't the unit's designated biologist. He was a diplomat. He had been sent as a scientist representative for the reclassification discussions. He had looked at a tactical problem that had nothing to do with his assignment and saw part of it in his spare time because it was there and it needed solving. After Osei sat down, Ohen Vass asked him, "Is this common among your people? This, doing things outside the assigned role?" Osei thought about it. "I'm not sure we think of it as outside the role," he said. "We have assignments. We take them seriously. But if there's something that needs doing and we can do it, the fact that it's not on the assignment sheet doesn't really enter into it." "Why not?" He looked at her with the expression that Ohen Vass would later describe in her internal notes as polite uncertainty at the question itself, as if he genuinely could not identify the mechanism that would cause someone to leave a problem unsolved when they could solve it. "Because it needs doing," he said. 3 weeks. 15 months. An agenda that ran to 67 pages of documentation by the time the formal sessions closed, none of which resembled the original schedule. The reclassification document that Ohen Vass submitted to the review committee was longer than any reclassification document in Accord history. Not because she was being thorough for its own sake, because the humans didn't fit any existing category and the document needed to build a new one from scratch. She titled the new category with a phrase that came from the third day of sessions, from something Dr. Nair had said almost in passing: generalist intelligence. Not soldier species, not science species, not any of the existing bins that 14,000 years of classification practice had built. Generalist intelligence, a species whose individual members carry the capacity for deep specialization in multiple unrelated domains simultaneously, whose collective problem-solving emerges from the intersection of those domains rather than from the domains in isolation, and whose relationship to unsolved problems appears to be constitutionally incompatible with passive observation. Incompatible with passive observation. 14,000 years of Accord history. 632 formal species classifications. Not one of them had ever needed that phrase. The committee approved the reclassification in 8 days, which was, for an Accord Review Committee, essentially instantaneous. Jonas Bekele sent Director Ohen Vass a handwritten note on the day the delegation departed. Human paper, human ink. The handwriting was the looping, slightly irregular script of someone who had learned to write by hand in a world that didn't strictly require it, and had kept doing it anyway. The note said, "Thank you for listening. We've been hoping someone would ask." Ohen Vass put it on her desk. It stayed there. 4 months later, when the first comprehensive Accord Earth Partnership framework was being negotiated, a real partnership built on what Earth was rather than what it had been classified as, including provisions for scientific collaboration, infrastructure development rights, educational exchange, and Accord-level economic participation, Ohen Vass would look at that note several times. At the handwriting, the paper, the choice to write by hand when faster options existed, the inability to observe an unfilled gap without filling it. A 17-year-old had sent a handwritten thank you note to an Accord director, across species, across institutional hierarchy, across the considerable gap between a junior diplomatic delegate and one of the most senior figures in galactic politics. Because the gap existed, and the note needed to be written, the reclassification changed things. Not all at once. Institutions moved on institutional time, and the Accord was an institution that had been moving on institutional time for 14,000 years. But it changed things. The first visible change was on the Karathi front. After the drainage channel operation and the Ridge breakthrough, Accord Military Command had quietly expanded the 14th Battalion's operational mandate from frontline support unit to special operations, advisory capable, which in the military classification system was an intermediate category that meant these beings can be asked to do things other than stand in a line and absorb fire. It was not a full reclassification. It was the kind of partial acknowledgement that large institutions make when the evidence is too obvious to ignore, but the paperwork for full acknowledgement has not yet been completed. Major Okafor had accepted this expanded mandate with the compressed line expression that Velreth had come to read as, "We'll take what we can get and build from here." She built from there. The Karathi front in the 6 months following the Ridge operation was different from the front in the 11 years preceding it. Not because the humans had done something that transformed it in a single action. The drainage operation had been decisive in one sector, but the front was long, and the Shriven were numerous, and single decisive actions don't end 11-year conflicts. It was different because of what the 14th brought to every situation that arose on its section of the front, the reflexive application of every lens available. The front had acquired, through the normal accretion of sustained conflict, a set of problems that everyone treated as permanent features of the landscape. The supply road through the valley at coordinate 12 Oz that flooded every third week and cut off forward positions for an average of 4 days each time. The Shriven communications relay in the eastern sector that Accord air assets had tried 17 times to destroy and that the Shriven rebuilt within 48 hours each time, apparently because they had a prefabricated component system and a cache supply of components that the Accord had never located. The forward medical station that was technically within the defended perimeter, but that required transit through a contested zone to reach from the main operating base, creating a casualty transport problem that had killed 6 medics in the previous year. These were known problems. They had been known for years. They had been noted in operational documentation, flagged in quarterly reviews, and discussed in staff sessions. They had not been solved because they fell into the category of things that were difficult within the frameworks available, and when things fell into that category, the institutional response was typically to document them and continue operating around them. The 14th did not operate around them. The supply road flooding problem was addressed in week 2. The battalion's engineer corporal, the same one who had built the unsolicited bridge, spent 3 days surveying the valley before proposing a drainage and elevation solution that used materials already available in the forward operating base's supply inventory. It was not a complex engineering project. It was the kind of thing that required noticing the problem, understanding the geology, knowing what materials you had, and connecting those 3 things, none of which was difficult, all of which required someone to look at the problem as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be managed. The supply road flooded once more after the fix was implemented, half as badly, for 1 day instead of 4. The Shriven Communications relay problem took longer. Lieutenant Reyes, the behavioral biologist in a reconnaissance role, had been tracking Shriven supply movements in the eastern sector for 6 weeks before she identified the pattern. They were not caching the relay components at a fixed location. They were moving the cache on a rotation schedule that mirrored almost exactly a food storage rotation behavior documented in Shriven biology research from 20 years ago. A survival behavior, hard-coded deep enough that even under battlefield conditions, the Shriven units responsible for relay maintenance followed it without apparent awareness. Reyes knew where the cache would be on any given day. The cache was destroyed. The relay went down. Without the prefabricated components, rebuilding time extended from 48 hours to 3 weeks, during which Accord air assets used the window to establish air superiority in the eastern sector for the first time in 4 years. The after-action report listed behavioral ecology analysis as the primary intelligence source. The Accord Military Review Board forwarded this report to species relations with a note that said, "See attached. Please advise on whether additional human units with comparable mixed specialization profiles are available for integration." Ohen Vass received this note on the same day she submitted the reclassification document. She sent back a response that was, for the Director of Species Relations, unusually brief. Read the reclassification first. Then, rephrase the question. The forward medical station problem was solved by Corporal Eshu, the communications specialist who wrote poetry. She solved it not through engineering or biology, but through the patient, detailed mapping of contested zone activity patterns over 8 weeks, during which she identified a 90-minute window each day when the contested zone was, based on movement data, reliably low activity on both sides. She documented the window, confirmed it across 30 separate observations, and proposed a transit protocol that allowed medical evacuations to use the direct route during the window with an acceptable risk profile. She had done this alongside her primary assignment: communications, infrastructure maintenance, message routing, signal intelligence. The medical transit problem was not her job. It was a problem she could see from where she worked, and it needed solving. 6 medics had died in the previous year. None died in the 6 months after Eshu's transit protocol was implemented. Velreth wrote about this in her personal log in a way she did not write in official documentation. She wrote, "I have been a commander for 200 years. I have worked with 17 species in joint operational contexts. I have never seen anything like this. It is not that they are smarter than other species. I do not think that is what it is. It is that they do not compartmentalize. Other species, my own included, operate within defined roles. You are a soldier or a scientist or a diplomat. The role organizes what problems you engage with. The human beings in my unit are all of those things simultaneously, and they appear to experience no conflict between them. Torres is a chemist and a room-clearing specialist, and he is both of these at the same time, without friction, without the sense that one identity requires leaving the other at the door. They are everything they have ever learned, all the time, applied to whatever is in front of them." She stopped, looked at what she had written. Added one more line. I think this is why the galaxy classified them wrong. Because the galaxy is organized around specialization. You're what you do. The humans are what they know. And they know everything they have ever been taught. Back at Accord Central, the reclassification was producing a different kind of disruption. The new category, generalist intelligence, had been approved. The implications of that approval were now working their way through 40 years of accumulated policy, treaty framework, economic agreement, and institutional relationship, the way that a single changed variable works through a system, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. The technology transfer caps were the first thing that needed revision. They had been set at levels appropriate for a soldier species: military technology, defensive systems, communication hardware, propulsion appropriate for tactical deployment. Under the new classification, Earth was eligible for the full suite of Accord Scientific and Industrial Technology Exchange, which was a category several orders of magnitude broader. The revision process required renegotiating 14 active agreements and reviewing another 31 for potential conflict with the new classification. The economic participation exclusions came next. Earth companies have been barred from Accord-level infrastructure development contracts on the grounds that their primary industrial capacity was military manufacturing. The reclassification changed that assessment because Earth's industrial capacity, reviewed without the military-first lens, turned out to include significant civilian infrastructure manufacturing, advanced materials production, and this was the detail that caused the longest staff meeting in Ohen Vass's 60-year tenure. An engineering consulting sector that had been operating almost entirely within Earth's own solar system for lack of Accord-level access, and that, based on the preliminary assessment Al-Hassan had provided during the delegation sessions, was producing solutions at a rate and quality that several Accord member species infrastructure ministries were going to find uncomfortable when they saw the numbers. The educational exchange provisions were perhaps the most immediately visible change. The Accord had an exchange program. It was old, well-established, highly regarded. Species sent their best students to Accord institutions. Accord institutions sent their best graduates out to member species. It was how knowledge moved through the galactic community. It was good. It worked. It had produced a great deal. Earth had been eligible for the exchange program in its military categories only. Officers could attend Accord Military Academy. Military engineers could access certain Accord technical programs. The civilian academic exchange, the one that covered sciences, arts, philosophy, economics, political theory, and the broader intellectual life of the Accord community, had been closed to Earth because closed to soldier species. It had been closed for 40 years. 40 years of Earth's universities producing graduates who could learn Accord knowledge only at institutional distance, through secondhand materials and approved technology transfers, but not in the rooms where the conversations happened. When the civilian exchange was opened, Earth's institutions submitted 7,000 applications in the first 30 days. 7,000. The Accord Exchange Office, which was staffed to process approximately 300 applications per quarter, sent a message to Ohen Vass that she kept in her files because it was the most candid communication she had received from a subordinate office in years. It said, "Director, we have a situation." Ohen Vass approved an emergency expansion of Exchange office staff. Then sent a personal message to the Exchange director that said, "Process as many as you can. These are people who have been waiting 40 years. Move as fast as the system allows, and then tell me where the system needs to change." The Exchange director's response: "Understood. Also, we've been reviewing the application materials. The breadth of disciplines represented is unlike anything in the existing applicant database. We have joint applicants, single individuals applying across 2 and sometimes 3 disciplines simultaneously. We don't have a processing framework for that." Build 1, Ohen Vass said. The same week that the Exchange Office was managing its 7,000 applications, a different situation was developing in the Accord's scientific liaison structure. Dr. Nair had returned to Earth after the delegation sessions, gone back to her work at the Pan Accord Scientific Liaison Office, and apparently treated the reclassification as the starting gun it was. Within 3 weeks, the liaison office had submitted 17 formal research collaboration proposals to Accord's scientific institutions. Proposals that, unlike anything Earth had previously submitted, reached into domains the military classification framework had made inaccessible. Fundamental physics, xenobiological research programs, long-range materials science, energy systems that were, based on the theoretical frameworks attached to the proposals, not incremental improvements on existing Accord technology, but genuine alternative approaches that had developed independently in Earth's research institutions, and that several Accord scientific reviewers, seeing them for the first time, described in their preliminary assessments with language that ranged from interesting to unexpectedly robust, to one review that simply said, "Where has this been? Where'd have been was Earth?" Behind a 3-page file and 40 years of classification that had organized everything the Accord gave Earth access to around the assumption that what Earth needed was weapons and what Earth offered was fighters. The scientific establishment of the Accord was not, as a whole, a comfortable place for disruption. It was old. Its hierarchies were old. Its peer review processes were old. The assumption that the Accord's scientific consensus represented the leading edge of galactic knowledge was woven into its institutional DNA in ways that were hard to see until something arrived that challenged it, because nothing had challenged it in a very long time. Dr. Nair's proposals challenged it. Not all of them. Many were collaborative, additive, designed to build on existing Accord work rather than contest it. But 3 of the 17 were different. 3 were built on theoretical frameworks that had developed in Earth's research institutions along trajectories that the Accord's scientific establishment had not taken. Not because the Accord scientists weren't capable of taking them, but because the established consensus had organized inquiry in a direction that led away from those trajectories, and nobody had been coming from outside the consensus to push back. Earth had been outside the consensus for 40 years. Earth's physicists have been working with Accord's scientific knowledge as it existed at first contact, plus whatever could be obtained through approved technology transfers, plus everything that Earth's own research produced. An isolated research ecosystem by the Accord standards. But isolation had a quality that the Accord's integrated, consensus-organized research establishment lacked. It forced the development of independent approaches. When you couldn't access the established solution, you found a different path to the problem. Sometimes the different path led nowhere. Sometimes it led somewhere the established solution hadn't reached. 3 of the 17 proposals had reached somewhere the established solution hadn't. The review process for those 3 proposals was contentious in ways that the Accord's scientific review process had not been contentious in Ohenvass's lifetime. Because what the proposals implied, not stated, not argued for aggressively, just implied by the theoretical frameworks they were built on, was that the Accord's established approach to 3 significant research domains had not been wrong, but had been incomplete, had been following one line of inquiry for so long that the other lines had been left unexplored, had been mistaking the edge of the current map for the edge of the territory. The researchers who reviewed those proposals and said interesting were the ones who understood this. The researchers who reviewed those proposals and said the equivalent of "this is not how we do things" were the ones who felt it. Ohenvass heard about the review process through Dorev, the Accord's chief scientific officer, who called her directly, not through the standard liaison channel, directly, to say that the human research proposals were causing a level of institutional discussion that she should probably be aware of. What kind of discussion? Ohenvass asked. The kind, Dorev said, that happens when something arrives from outside the room that changes what the room thought it knew. Is that a problem? A pause. Dorev was 400 years old and had run the Accord's scientific establishment for 60 of them. The pause had the texture of someone choosing words carefully. No, the chief scientific officer said finally. It's not a problem. It's what the scientific process is supposed to do. I'm calling because I want you to understand that this is going to be louder than most things that come through your office. These proposals are going to change some things. And the people whose things get changed are going to have opinions. They'll have opinions, Ohenvass said. What will the science do? Another pause. Warmer this time. The science, Dorev said, will do what science does. Follow the evidence. Ohenvas looked at Jonas Bekele's handwritten note, still on her desk. Good, she said. That's all we need. She put down the communication array and looked at the window where Accord's central city structure spread out below her. The towers, the transit lines, the accumulated infrastructure of 14,000 years of galactic civilization, built by species that had been here long enough to forget what it felt like to be new. Below that city, somewhere in the queue, 7,000 applications, 17 research proposals, a renegotiation of 40 years of treaty framework, a rebuilt bridge on the Karathi front that nobody had asked for and everybody was using. The inability to observe an unfilled gap without filling it. The director of species relations, for the first time in 60 years, could not predict what the next year would look like. That was a new sensation. It felt, in a way she didn't have a precise word for, like the beginning of something. The moment the Accord stopped managing Earth and started listening to it, the Accord discovered something it had not anticipated. Earth had a great deal to say. Not just Dr. Nair's research proposals, not just the 7,000 exchange applications, not just the treaty renegotiations and the economic restructuring and the infrastructure partnership frameworks that Al Hassan and Sorensen were building with the focused energy of two people who had spent years studying agreements they considered inadequate and were now finally allowed to propose something better. Not just any single thing. Everything simultaneously, in the particular human way, all the gaps filling at once because they had all existed at once, and a species constitutionally incapable of leaving gaps unfilled was now inside the room. It was loud. The Accord, as an institution, had a volume setting. 14,000 years of practice at managing relationships between species with different needs, different timelines, different capacities for change and disruption. The volume setting was calibrated to absorb what the existing classified species produced, the requests, the proposals, the disputes, the negotiations, at a pace that the institutional architecture could process without stress fracturing. Earth filed things at the pace of a species that had been waiting 40 years. The reclassification had gone through 8 months ago. In those 8 months, the volume of formal communications between Earth and Accord administrative bodies had increased by a factor that Ohenvas's staff, who tracked these metrics, described in a report to her office as unprecedented and not well modeled by any existing volume projection framework. Ohenvas read this report and thought about the 7,000 exchange applications and thought, yes, I know. Keep up. The Accord kept up. It was harder than it should have been, which told Ohenvas something about how the institution had been structured, to process what it expected, at the rate it expected, from the species it had classified as being capable of producing it. Earth had been expected to produce certain things at certain rates. The expectation had been built into the processing architecture. The expectation had been wrong. She requested a structural review of Accord administrative processing capacity. The review took 3 months and produced a document that identified 46 points of institutional bottleneck where the existing frameworks were calibrated to a model of species contribution that the reclassification had made obsolete. Fixing those bottlenecks took 18 months. During those 18 months, Ohenvas's staff manually routed Earth's communications through workarounds that were, by every standard of institutional efficiency, terrible, and also necessary because the alternative was telling Earth to slow down, and that was not going to work. Major Okafor's voice in the session that felt like the beginning of it all. We've been in a core relationship for 40 years, and nobody has ever asked us what we want to build. The Accord was now at significant institutional cost, learning what 40 years of that answer had accumulated into. On the Karathi front, the war ended. Not quickly. Wars of 11 years don't end quickly. But the deterioration of shriven operational capacity that had begun with the drainage channel operation and the communications relay disruption had continued and had been augmented over 8 months by a steady series of tactical innovations that the 14th Battalion produced at a rate that Accord Military Command had eventually stopped treating as exceptional and started treating as operational baseline. The final Shriven withdrawal from the Karathi sector was documented in a military action report filed by Commander Velreth on a Tuesday morning in language that was, by her own standards, understated. The report described the outcome, the tactical sequence that produced it, and a brief assessment of contributing factors. It was 4 pages. On the last page, she added one sentence that was not technically required by the after-action format. The primary contributing factor to this outcome was the integration of human units whose capabilities were, for 11 years of this conflict's duration, unavailable to accord command on the grounds of a species classification that did not accurately describe them. She submitted the report and went to find Okafor. The Major was in the forward position that had been the ridge, the position that had changed hand for 3 years and stopped changing hands on the day of the drainage channel operation. It was a clear morning. The front, for the first time in 11 years, was quiet in a way that meant something. Okafor was standing at the edge of the position looking at the valley below, and she had the look she had when she was processing something she wasn't going to say out loud in full. The compressed expression, the still quality. Velreth stood next to her. They were quiet for a moment. Then Velreth said, "I would like to ask you something I should have asked 2 years ago." Okafor waited. "What do you want to do next?" Okafor looked at her. The compressed expression moved into something else, the smile that wasn't quite a smile, the one that meant understood, and more than understood. "That," she said, "is an excellent question." What came next for Okafor and the 14th was a reassignment that would not have been possible under the old classification, and that under the new one had been proposed by Accord Military Command within weeks of the reclassification approval. A forward development posting, not a combat posting. A frontier sector that the Accord had been trying to establish civilian infrastructure in for 6 years, where the infrastructure projects kept running into problems that the deployed engineering teams couldn't solve, partly because the engineering teams were species specialists who were excellent at their particular engineering disciplines and kept encountering problems that fell outside those disciplines, and partly because the frontier had a way of generating problems that fell outside. Established disciplines by design, because established disciplines had been built on the core worlds, not the frontier. The 14th arrived at the frontier sector, looked at the problems, began filling gaps. The first significant project was a water extraction and distribution system for a settlement of 60,000 beings on a planet whose subsurface geology had confounded 3 separate engineering teams from 2 species. The problem was that the subsurface geology of the planet behaved differently from what the geological models predicted, models that had been built on core world geological data and assumed certain relationships between mineral composition, pressure, and fluid dynamics that did not hold on this planet's particular formation type. Torres looked at the geology, not the models. The actual geology, which he and 2 other battalion members spent 2 weeks mapping at close range in conditions that the previous engineering teams had rated as prohibitively difficult for sustained survey work, and that the 14th apparently rated as challenging but manageable. The geological survey produced a subsurface map that did not match any of the existing models. Torres built a new model. The new model identified a water table configuration that the old models had predicted didn't exist. The water table existed. The extraction system was designed around the actual geology. It worked. 60,000 beings got reliable water. The architect, Lieutenant Mass, who had been part of the original delegation to Accord Central and then subsequently commissioned into the Frontier Development posting because someone had finally noticed that having a trained architect in a construction-intensive assignment was probably worth doing, designed the distribution infrastructure. Not just functional infrastructure. Infrastructure that integrated with the existing settlement architecture in ways that the previous infrastructure projects had not, that acknowledge how the beings living there actually used space, where they went, how they moved, what they needed to access. She had spent 3 days walking the settlement before she drew a single line. The engineers on the previous teams had not done that. They had built to the technical requirements. She built to the people. The Settlement Council sent a formal commendation to Accord Military Command. Then sent a second one to Species Relations. Then And this was the detail that Ohen Vass kept in her personal file about the Frontier posting. The Settlement Council chair sent a personal message to Earth, not to an institution, to Earth, addressed to the people who came because the chair apparently did not know the correct institutional routing and decided the feeling was more important than the protocol. It reached Earth's Global Council office. Someone that made sure it was read widely. Back at Accord Central, the scientific review process for Dr. Nair's 3 contested proposals concluded in a proceeding that Dorev had described as louder than most things, and that turned out to be louder still. The review board had expanded twice. First to include additional reviewers with relevant specialization, then to include mediators because the review had developed into a genuine scientific dispute rather than a routine assessment, and genuine scientific disputes required a different kind of management. The dispute was not about whether the human theoretical frameworks were valid. The preliminary experiments, run by Accord laboratory teams on the framework's predictions, had confirmed validity. The experiments had been run precisely because the review board contained members who had hoped the frameworks were wrong and had insisted on experimental confirmation as a condition of acceptance. The experiments confirmed validity. The frameworks were valid. The dispute was about what the validity meant. One camp argued that the human frameworks were interesting extensions of existing Accord science, novel approaches that added nuance to established understanding without fundamentally challenging it. The findings could be integrated into the current consensus without requiring the consensus to change significantly. The other camp argued that 2 of the 3 frameworks, if followed where the logic led, would require the current consensus to change significantly. Not to be discarded, the existing work was not wrong, it was just incomplete in specific ways, but to be revised. Sections of established understanding that had been considered settled for centuries would need to be reopened. The dispute was about whether to open them. Dorev let it run. She had been doing this for 60 years, and she understood that certain disputes needed to exhaust themselves before they resolved. She watched the back and forth, read the position papers, sat through 3 formal sessions, and waited. Dr. Nair, who had returned to Accord Central for the final review sessions at the board's request, had been present and largely quiet through the formal proceedings, listening with the focused attention that seemed to be her mode for taking a room's full measure before engaging with it. On the 3rd formal session's 2nd day, the board chair asked if she wished to speak. She stood up. She said, "I understand the concern about reopening settled questions. I want to be clear that we're not proposing that settled science was wrong. We're proposing that it was answered in a context, and the context has expanded. When the context expands, the questions expand with it. That's not a challenge to what you know. It's an invitation to know more." She sat down. The room was quiet. Dorev, from her position at the head of the observers table, looked at the board members, at the ones who were processing, at the ones who already understood and were waiting for the others, at the ones who were resistant and were now, under the weight of valid experimental data and the plainness of what Nair had just said, doing the internal work of deciding whether their resistance was scientific or something else. The vote to formally accept all 3 proposals and open the relevant consensus domains for extended review passed 14-3. The 3 dissenting votes submitted formal objections. The formal objections were documented and filed. They would be part of the record. That was how the process worked. That was why the process worked. Dorev messaged Ohen Vass that evening. The proposals passed. The domains are open. Also, that physicist of theirs is remarkable. Where do they find people like that? Ohen Vass. Everywhere, apparently. It's in the reclassification document. 2 years after the reclassification, the Accord conducted the first formal review of its first contact protocols in 100 years. The review was triggered by a provision in the reclassification document. Ohen Vass had included a clause recommending protocol review whenever a reclassification revealed systematic gaps in a classification system, and the Earth reclassification had revealed a systematic gap the size of a species. The review committee was larger than the standard composition. It included At Ohenvass's recommendation and the Accord Chair's approval, 3 human representatives. Not as subjects of review, as members of the committee. Jonas Bekele was 20 years old. He was not a diplomat yet. He was a student midway through his first year in Accord institution on an exchange program that had not existed when he was 17. He was not on the committee, but he had submitted through the formal public comment process that the review had opened a 6-page document about the first contact experience from a receiving species perspective that the committee chair had read aloud in the first session because it was the clearest articulation of a particular problem that anyone on the committee had seen. The problem, as Bekele had written it, when you classify a species before you know it, you teach yourself what questions not to ask. And then you never ask them. And the species on the other side lives inside your unasked questions for decades. That's not anyone's fault. It's a structural problem. And structural problems have structural solutions. The committee chair read this and then looked at the room and said, "The young human has given us our agenda." The revised first contact protocol that emerged from the review was 40 pages longer than the previous version. It contained a new primary assessment framework that placed the question, what does this species value and want to build, before military capacity assessment in the formal evaluation sequence. It contained provisions for multi-domain capability assessment that required evaluators to look for generalist patterns rather than assuming specialization. It contained a mandatory review clause that required all active species classifications to be re-evaluated under the new framework within 10 years. 308 active species classifications. The administrative burden of that review would occupy Accord species relations for a decade. Ohenvass had signed off on it without hesitation, because the alternative, leaving 308 files potentially as wrong as Earth's file had been for decades or centuries more, was a kind of blindness she had decided somewhere in the 3 weeks of delegation sessions and the 8 months since that she was no longer willing to maintain. The formal ceremony marking Earth's new partnership status, not allied species, not a managed member, but a full partnership with Accord-level rights, responsibilities, and participation, was held at Accord Central. It was attended by most of the original delegation, plus 100 new faces, scientists, engineers, educators, economists, architects, a musician who had been invited because someone at the Accord Cultural Exchange Office had, in the process of the exchange program expansion, listened to recorded human music and made a decision that it needed to be in the same room as the galactic community. Commander Velreth attended. She was no longer on the Karathi front. That front was closed. She was in an advisory role, which had been created specifically because her 3 years of working alongside human units had given her an analytical framework for human operational integration that nobody else in Accord Military Command had, and operational frameworks were useful things to retain. Major Okafor was there, back from the frontier for the ceremony. She was in dress uniform again. The compressed expression, the still quality, but not. And this was what Velreth noticed across the ceremony hall. Not performing calm. Actually calm. The kind that comes from a situation having moved in the direction it needed to move. Ohenvass gave the formal address. It was diplomatic language. It had to be. It was a diplomatic occasion, but she had insisted on a section that was not diplomatic language, that was direct language, and she had written it herself. She said, "We made an error. It was not a malicious error, and it was not a careless error. It was an honest error of the kind that institutions make when they believe their frameworks are complete. We classified a species by what we saw in a moment of conflict, and we kept that classification for 40 years. In those 40 years, we deployed them in wars, and managed them in treaties, and work alongside them in operations, and never asked the question that should have been in our first contact protocol. What do you want to build? We know the answer now. We have been learning it for 2 years. We will be learning it for a long time. That is not a failure of our process. That is the process working correctly on the correct timeline. The timeline where we were willing to be wrong and willing to change." She paused. The Accord has gained a partner today. Not a soldier species. Not a classified member. A partner. Everything that means is still being determined. That determination will be carried out together. That is what partnership means. The room was full of species who communicated in 17 different primary modes: chemical signal, harmonic resonance, bioluminescent pattern, sonic vibration, and others more difficult to describe. All of them, in whatever mode was native to them, produced the equivalent of silence. Then, the equivalent of response. Then, something that was across 17 modes and 14,000 years of Accord history knew. Velreth found Okafor after the ceremony. They stood near a window in the reception space, watching the city. "What's next?" Velreth asked. She had taken to asking this question. She had learned that it was the right one. Okafor looked at the city, the towers, the transit infrastructure, all of it built by species who had been here long enough to settle into what they had built and stop asking what came after. "There's a frontier sector in the outer arm," Okafor said. 3 geological survey teams have gone in and not found a stable region for settlement. There's something wrong with the subsurface modeling. The standard framework doesn't account for something in a rock formation type, and nobody's identified what yet. And you want to find it. Torres wants to find it. I want to let Torres find it. She paused, and then I want to find whatever comes after that. Velreth looked at the city, then at Okafor, at a species that had been classified by a moment of conflict and had turned out to be something the Accord's entire framework of categories had not been built to hold. Not soldiers, not scientists, not diplomats or engineers or architects or chemists who wrote poetry in their off hours. All of those things, simultaneously, applied to whatever was in front of them, moving toward the gap, always toward the gap. The galaxy had thought it knew what humans were. The galaxy had been looking at one angle of one moment of one facet of a species that did not reduce to angles. Velreth had spent 2 years watching them and was still not sure she had the right category. She was beginning to think the right category would need to be built from scratch. And she was beginning to think that when it was built, Earth would probably help. Not because they were asked, because the gap was there. And gaps, for humans, were just doors that hadn't been opened yet.